Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise.
The new Synodal Church has blessed us, maybe, with a proposed new Rosary. Now, this does not come from Rome. This does not come from Cardinal Mario Gresh. It does not come from Cardinal Hollerich or Pope Leo or anybody we instinctively associate with the new Synodal Church. None of the bigwigs in Rome who ran the Synod on Synodality and will continue to run it, because you might think the Synod on Synodality is old news. It's not. There are more meetings coming and more documents from those meetings coming in 2028 and 2029. And I want to ask you something here, because somebody in my chat here, Robert's he went over this himself with his family, and their reaction to this was as bad as you might expect. It's like a new religion. Those pushing this keep calling it the new Synodal Church. And Robert says, I want to say this opened my eyes to what Anthony was saying. First, I did not want to really believe it. But when I saw this, I then saw what you were talking about. And what I'm talking about is essentially, they keep calling it the new Synodal Church. They called it that we need to have the Catholic Church needs to have a conversion. Not that Catholics need to have an interior conversion, that we have become a sinful, dreadfully at best, the best amongst us, dreadfully lukewarm and too tolerant of error generation. Not that. That would actually be refreshing to hear, as hard as it would be to hear. Because it is my assertion that the very best Catholics that we know would have been considered, in the more heroic ages of the church, average, maybe. It's my assertion. I know that sounds like I'm pointing fingers at other people. Don't worry, I don't think I would be considered anywhere near average in those times. But they call it a new Synodal Church. Maybe we should believe them. So, before we get to that, I want to give you a couple of very brief news updates. It was formally announced from Rome, according to Celere Non Possum, that on November 1st, the Pope will name John Henry Newman a doctor of the Church. Quoting him directly, I am pleased to announce that on November 1st, within the context of the Jubilee of the educational world, whatever that is, I will confer the title of Doctor of the Church upon St. John Henry Newman, who contributed in a decisive way to the renewal of the theology and the understanding of Christian doctrine and its development. That's what he had to say. Not everybody is taking that well, because he's focusing there on renewal of theology, which is one of the things we hear about from modernists, talking about how, well, John Henry Newman said doctrine develops. And so we can develop forcibly doctrine into pretzel forms of new things and turn Catholic theology into something it's not. They use John Henry Newman that way. I'm not saying that's what John Henry Newman was up to, but there's an entire rabbit hole you can go down to, including what Pius X thought of John Henry Newman and what he thought of people using John Henry Newman. It gets very complicated very quickly. The other bit of news, and this is not great news, this comes to us from Rorate Chaley. Adding to the mystery of what is going on, another traditional mass suppressed St. Cecilia's in Brooklyn, New York. A traditional parish that, like many of them, is practically standing room only for its high mass on Sunday. Very brief, from a reader in the Diocese of Brooklyn in New York City, another violent suppression of a traditional Latin Mass. Just announced after Mass today that Bishop Brennan is ending the traditional Latin Mass at this church in Brooklyn, New York on October 12th. The justification, enforcing Traditionis Custodes. And many of us ask the question of why are they doing that? Because I suspect they think they'll get away with it. That somebody in Rome, whether it's the Pope or at least Cardinal Arthur Roach, the prefect for the Dicastery of the Liturgy, has their back on this. After all, they're just enforcing expiring permissions that were given 2 years ago, extensions for the implementation of Traditionis Custodes. So that's the new Synodal Church in action. We now go to UCA Catholic for our main story. Under this, I can't help but laugh at the brazenness of this. This is so ridiculous. On this brazen headline, expand your rosary with the synodal mysteries. Ladies and gentlemen, I can only describe to you these synodal mysteries as being the DEI rosary. It's all there. It is 35 mysteries said over 7 days, 5 mysteries a day that you are to pray and reflect upon. This is the rosary for those who find 50 Hail Marys, 50 Our Fathers, 50 Glory Bees, and 50 Fatima prayers, plus the invocation at the beginning, or if you're in Europe, at the end, the Our Father and 3 Aves. Too much. So it's a shorter one. And maybe you're uncomfortable meditating on the life of Jesus Christ because he was very rigid, don't you know? And so you can do this, be a little more inclusive, and meditate on the Acts of the Apostles, which is the modernist favorite book of the Bible, even though they don't understand a lick of it. We go here to the article. Not all of it. After we go a little bit of the article, we'll talk about what they've said, and then skip down to showing you what these mysteries are. My Catholic vocabulary expanded on March 7th, 2020, when Pope Francis announced the Synod on Synodality. I knew what a synod was because the Church had been holding them since its earliest days, but synodality was a novel concept. Yes, it was. But let's continue. Some clarity came several months later when the Vatican released a handbook designed to guide the Church on its synodal journey. If you feel your testosterone dropping every time you hear this kind of language, don't worry, you're not alone. Dioceses were directed to organize local listening sessions around the interconnected theme of communion, participation, and mission. Catholics and non-Catholics were invited to boldly express their views related to some guiding questions without fear of reprisal for unconventional opinions. These findings would be gathered, synthesized, and discussed by diverse groups nationally, regionally, and globally. An implementation phase would involve enacting specific conclusions. More importantly, the process was designed to initiate a new style of decision-making throughout the Church. I wondered how this would function considering we were still in the 2020, we were still in the COVID times. Apparently, you can say that word on YouTube, so we're going to test the waters on that one. But the idea of the entire Catholic Church sharing in a worldwide conversation captivated me. It was as if Francis had further opened the window Pope John the 23rd had unlocked when calling Vatican II. And then it goes on a little bit to this. Let's just go right to the mysteries, because he's very long-winded here to tell you all about it. So let's just jump down here. Here are the 7 main mysteries of the synodal mysteries of the Rosary. Each mystery comes from the Acts of the Apostles and includes a fruit of the mystery. So on Sunday, you are praying the attentional synodal mysteries, which begins with reading the gospel and with the fruit of the mystery being listening to Scripture. And then waiting on the Spirit, and the fruit of the mystery is patience. Then you are praying in the cenacle, with the fruit of the mystery being inclusion. And then Peter stands to speak, with the fruit being reciprocity. And then you get the selection of Matthias, with the fruit of the mystery being discernment. Monday, the Pentecostal synodal mysteries. You get the descent of the Spirit, which gives you boldness of speech. Multitude in Jerusalem is what you reflect upon, with the fruit of the mysteries being diversity. And then you get St. Peter's sermon, which gives you the fruit of the mystery being encounter, whatever that means. And then the baptism of the 3,000 leads to the fruit of the mystery being generosity. And then growth of the church and joy. Tuesday, the ecclesial synodal mysteries. Healing at the beautiful gate. The fruit being giving what one has. That might also be called charity. Prayer after persecution, with the fruit being prayer. 3, care for the needy. Generosity. The selection of deacons. Collaboration. Burial of Stephen. Compassion. If some of these sound repetitive, it's because they kind of are. There's a lot of synonyms being used here. Wednesday, evangelization. Curious what they mean by evangelization, because everything I've heard about the gospel when they invoke it doesn't actually sound like the gospel as proclaimed by the Catholic Church. It sounds like something much more worldly, materialistic. But what you meditate on is Philip and the Ethiopian treasurer, and the mystery is dialogue, or the fruit is dialogue. The raising of Dorcas, charity, for like the third time under different words. And then mission to Cornelius, the fruit being transformation of conflict. The fourth mystery is the church in Antioch, and reflection gives you the fruit unity. The deliverance of St. Peter, with listening to unexpected voices. Thursday, reconciliation. The first mystery is the controversy concerning circumcision. And you get, again, discernment. It's the second time discernment is listed. The Synod of Jerusalem, again, communion. The Jerusalem Decree, and the sensus fidei, or the sense of faith. The reception of the decree, mystery, the fruit of mystery is joy, again. They're giving you the same ones multiple times. The disagreement between Paul and Barabbas gives you evangelical frankness. The Fridays, you would meditate on the missional synodal mysteries. Guarantee if you type missional into any like Word document, you'll probably get it'll probably get flagged as a typo. First, the mission to Derbe and Lystra, inculturation. And all those times I reported to you on the Amazon, rite of Mass, the Zaire use rite of Mass, weird distortions of even the new Mass in local cultures by bringing in pagan elements. Australia comes to mind. Now you're going to be able to just smile and go, oh, isn't that beautiful? Instead of going, why are they praying to demons? 2, the conversion of Lydia. The fruit is hospitality. 3, St. Paul's speech in Athens, with the fruit proclamation. 4, St. Paul in Ephesus. The fruit is conversion. 5, raising of Eutychus, with the devotion to the Eucharist being the fruit. And then Saturday, to round it out, the pilgrimage synodal mysteries. The arrival in Troas. The fruit is setting sail. What does that mean? Prophecy of Agabus. The fruit is trust. Sailing toward Italy. The fruit is perseverance. The shipwreck at sea. The fruit is listening in the spirit. 5 is arrival on Malta. The fruit is assuming the best in others. This whole nonsense was put together by somebody calling themselves Kevin Beck. And I will assume the best in this person, that he meant well. But you don't need to mess with the Holy Rosary. That's a road that leads to folly. And I will show you what I mean. I'm not the only one who said that. Novus Ordo Watch, a sedevacantist news outlet. They do good reporting. I'm not a sedevacantist, but they do good news reporting, unequivocally. They said this, and tell me how you can disagree with this. Such a deconstruction of the actual Holy Rosary will ensure that the real Rosary will become completely irrelevant. While it's perfectly legitimate for a Catholic to meditate on various pericopes found in the Book of Acts, these are not mysteries of the Rosary, with the exception, of course, of the Ascension and Descent of the Holy Ghost, which are part of the glorious mysteries, and therefore do not come with the promises and indulgences attached to praying of the actual Rosary. And then there's, of course, this. Mr. Beck, in his wisdom, decided that you meditating on these passages of Scripture that he selected for his little fake rosary would come with fruits that come with meditation. Under what authority did he do that? It's rather presumptuous of him, or maybe it was rather synodal of him to do that. That's the kind of one of the problems here. Novus Ordo Watch, of course, telling you the real problem, which is dilution of the actual rosary. This is a great rosary for people who know, I want to pray more, but Jesus was a little too rigid, or the gospel scares me, so I'm going to really lean into the synodality stuff. And look, I'm praying the rosary. Well, no, you're not. You're praying a reflection on the current fad in the church. Sel Brown with a super chat. Thank you. Says, can we add to the mysteries? Why can't we have the traditional Latin Mass? Well, we'll get to that in a few minutes, actually. I've got a report on that for you in just a few minutes. Don't worry. Now, it's synodality, we're told, comes from Vatican II. You kind of pull from the language of the Council Fathers, this age of listening to the laity will save the church stuff, where they basically gave us permission to go become activists on behalf of the church, which was their great folly. It's how you get the legitimization of the old recognize and resist movement. Recognize and resist, I think, right now is on life support because so many of the voices have fallen silent in pointing out all these evil things happening in the church. But It's again, as Novus Ordo Watch points out in another post, take away Vatican II, and these people would have nothing to believe in, nothing to work for, nothing to talk about. And that's in relation to this. The official synod.va, the Synod on Synodality's actual official account on X, this is their official account. I've used it multiple times. The official Vatican account featuring content from the General Secretariat of the Synod, which I believe is Cardinal Gresh. They're quoting some stuff here from the Cardinal, saying, at a seminar celebrating the centenary of the birth of Father Austin Flannery OP, Cardinal Gresh drew a vital connection between Vatican II and the path of a synodal church. Let me then give you some quotes here. Now, he's there to celebrate a dearly beloved priest who's probably on the path to canonization, and he's sitting there selling you on synodality. A synodal church, a church which listens. Oh, stunning, brave even, Cardinal. As if the Catholic Church didn't actually listen to people. He continues saying, understanding the Council's teaching regarding the relationship between divine revelation and human faith is key to understanding the very purpose of being a synodal church, a church which listens. All the baptized, lay, religious, and ordained are called to participate spiritually in God's friendship and to participate actively in the life and mission of the church. That mission is to proclaim and bring to reality the kingdom of God on earth, as proclaimed by Jesus Christ. The Worldwide Synod seeks to listen to the Holy Spirit's guidance on how best to fulfill that mission until the eschaton. A synodal church under the oversight of the hierarchy seeks to listen to the diverse sensus fidei of all the baptized, meaning even like heretics in the church get to have their errors listened to. Out the window goes error having no rights. Diverse sensus fidei, meaning the sense of faith can lead different people to different assumptions about the church and about the faith. You begin to see the problem here. And the diverse perspectives of those within particular charisms granted by the Spirit for the particular circumstances of their culture and circumstance. So cultural relativism is part of the sensus fidei now. And therein kind of lies the problem. Now, it was asked earlier by Sal Brown with a nice super chat that, well, can we add to the mysteries? Why can't we have the traditional Latin Mass? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I've told you about, and in light of the new synodal mysteries of the Rosary that the synodalists really want you to adopt. Now, if you're find 50 Hail Marys, 5 Our Fathers, plus the prayers at the beginning and the Glory Bees and the rest of the components of the Rosary a little too much, and maybe the gospel a little too scary or too rigid, and you want to meditate on a particular reading of the book of Acts, and you want to gain the fruits of those mysteries being diversity, listening, equity, sharing repeatedly, and of course inclusion. Yes, the DEI mysteries. If you want to embrace that, and the same people who really want you to do that, they are now starting to push back on traditionalists and tradition-friendly bishops, cardinals in the Roman Curia, who have been quietly talking to the media and peacefully saying this is a good time for the Pope to undo his restrictions on the Latin Mass. You're seeing this coming from a lot of different quarters. These are fairly high-profile cardinals and other bishops who said, I don't really agree with Traditionis Custodes, actually. It'd be a good time for the Pope to lift the restrictions a bit. There are a number of those, and I report on them when they come down the pike. And now, the same people who brought you the new synodal mysteries are bringing you this. Same outlet. Written by Robert Mickens, headline, Reviving the Old Latin Mass would be a colossal mistake. A number of traditionalist bishops, that's laughable, encouraged by young self-appointed Catholic influencers on social media, are trying to pressure Pope Leo to undo the restrictions of the pre-Vatican II liturgy. So, first correction here, not a single one of the bishops or cardinals advocating for a restoration of the traditional Mass in some way are traditionalists. Not a single one. They're tradition-friendly. Some of them are traditionally minded in a lot of ways. But none of them are traditionalists. When you really dig deep into what they promote, virtually every single one of them tells you the problem with Vatican II was not the contents of the document, it was its implementation. And that's the dividing line. Because the problem with Vatican II was it promoted a new ecclesiology, a new theology on what the church's mission is in the world. what it understands the gospel to be, what man's relationship to God is. And from everything there, you get all the weird stuff that came from Vatican II, including the changes to the liturgy. But not only that, to communion in the hand being acceptable, to weird conferences at the Vatican on secular political issues that have nothing to do with the salvation of souls. And until you address the ecclesiological problems, which then give you the doctrinal changes and the toleration of heresy and the suppression of tradition, you're never going to fix the problems. And of course, that's why there are no traditionalist bishops. The closest is Bishop Schneider. He's an assistant bishop, and I don't see him getting a promotion anytime soon because he's already started correcting Pope Leo publicly on a couple of occasions. But this is the new pushback. It would be a colossal mistake to reviving the old Mass. And who did they have write this? Mr. Robert Mickens, who is widely well regarded and not always considered the most hardcore voice of the new Synodal Church. Here's his argument. And yes, for those of you who might be younger, he insults Gen Z explicitly here. Quote, at a time when the world is plunged into a deep darkness not seen in many decades, and some would say is being held captive and being destroyed by a handful of evil, cynical men, it's flabbergasting that the Catholic Church is so self-absorbed to think it has the luxury to spend even 10 minutes fighting over an internal affair such as its liturgy. And while the latest skirmish over the reform of the Mass that followed the Second Vatican Council does not rise to the acrimony that the early decades immediately after the Council, a number of traditionalist retrodox bishops led by Cardinals Raymond Burke and Robert Serra, both very conservative, traditionally minded, but I would counter any claim that they're traditionalists, have seized on the election of a new pope to once again try to bring back the Mass that was celebrated from the 16th century Council of Trent up until the crushing majority of bishops at Vatican II, some 400 years later, approved the broad guidelines for it to be reformed and replaced, although the pro-Tridentinists continue to deny this last caveat, end quote. That's because it's false. Everything he said there is false. The documents of Vatican II do not call for a new Mass. It calls for the Mass that existed to have some changes made to it. Some parts of some of the prayers, include like the Our Father, for example, done in the vernacular, meaning done in the language of whatever laity you were having the Mass for. To have the gospel proclaimed in the vernacular, the ordinary language of the laity. It didn't call for a new Mass. And the other thing about this, the traditional Latin Mass was not said from the Council of Trent onwards. The traditional Latin Mass developed organically throughout the history of the Latin West. What the Council of Trent did through Pius V, through his quo primum document, was essentially ban new Masses. No bishop, no matter the way the document's written, nobody in the church was allowed to develop a new form of the Mass. And that document then banned anybody from doing it and banned any new Mass, which it defined as younger than 200 years old. Banned them. And it made the normative rite what we now call the traditional Latin Mass, which had existed going back to antiquity. That's the truth. And yet these voices, these synodalists, they keep pushing the lie that the Council of Trent came up with a new Mass. If you know this is nonsense, if you know anything about the Reformation, what Martin Luther's complaints were about the liturgy, because they're the same as the anti-TLM people. They basically invoke Luther without even realizing it because they don't know what they're talking about. He goes on here to attack Gen Z. Quote, Burke and his cohort are being encouraged in their efforts by a cadre of Gen Z youth on social media who call themselves Catholic influencers. It seems obvious enough that these young people were never catechized adequately about the broader and deeper tradition of the Church. In fact, they admit as much, and some even loudly complain about it. This is not entirely their fault. The implementation of Vatican II and its doctrinally rich decrees and teachings was not always well handled. But to complain about that instead of diving into the text themselves is a lazy way to shift blame onto a previous generation. Says the guy calling Gen Z clueless. He's attacking Gen Z to defend what some Gen Z people call the boomer right. Now, if you watch me for a long time, I don't get into the boomer this, boomer that stuff. I think the problem is much more complicated than blaming a generation out of hand for anything. And that every generation, in my memory, had some kind of baggage that it had. I'm tail end of Gen X. I could go off for hours about the problems of Gen X. So I don't do the boomer this, boomer that thing. But here he is attacking Gen Z, which, by the way, I've seen Gen Z Catholic influencers, and I don't know who they're talking about for because they don't latch on to Cardinal Burke or Cardinal Sarah. They don't, not from what I've seen. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong about that, but I haven't seen it. Yet, despite their admitted lack of solid theological training, they still believe that the pre-Vatican II liturgy is somehow superior to the current ritual we celebrate. How is that? And then he goes into this. In my opinion, the traditional Latin Mass, with all its ritual precision and theological depth, continues to attract young Catholics because it refuses to compromise the signs of the sacred, said one of them in an article titled The Black Catholic Chick, hopes Pope Leo embraces Gen Z's desire for tradition, which was recently posted on the National Catholic Reporter website. The use of Latin, incense chant, sacred silence, and the like are not frivolous or outdated. They engage the whole person, body, mind, and soul, in an act of worship that lifts us out of ourselves and into the presence of God, wrote another, presumably Gen Z author. Yes, and guess what? Latin, incense, chant, sacred silence, and the like were never eliminated from the liturgy after Vatican II, even if some presbyters, meaning priests, and their communities undervalued or decided not to avail themselves of these elements. And he's basically echoing what Pope Leo said. His famous interview with Crux magazine, where he said he didn't really know much about the traditional Mass himself. He didn't understand the argument too much. He made that very clear in that interview. But he said, he says, if you want these things, you can get those in the new Mass. And that's the problem, because it's not about the Latin. Yes, we defend the use of Latin, because once you turn it into the everyday language, your priest can then start changing the prayers of the Mass, including the Eucharistic prayers. He can start ad-libbing it and turning it into a rite of personal glorification. You've all seen it. All of us have, by going to a new Mass at some point. Where even if your normal everyday priest that you go to every Sunday, even if he follows the instructions of the Roman Missal to the T, offers the new Mass the way it should be, this is not going after him. But we've all seen it. We've all seen where the priest turns himself into a carnival barker or starts monkeying around with the Eucharistic rite or whatever it is. The Latin prevents that. But this isn't about the Latin. This is about the ecclesiology that underpins the Mass, the theology of what it is. Is it a community-centered meal of sacrifice, or is it something else? And the traditionalists will tell you it's something else. And we true traditionalists don't really talk much about the richness of the rite versus the new rite. We don't, because it's more than that. But he's reducing it to that, to illustrate the point that he thinks that traditionalists, especially Gen Z traditionalists, are clueless. This is the same outfit that tried to sell you a new synodal rosary so that you could meditate on various things that happened in Acts of the Apostles that they then twist and contort to be about diversity and being super inclusive and giving of yourself and being equitable. They turned it secular. And now they're beginning to use their not inconsiderable weight. Robert Mickens is a heavyweight voice on the progressive side, on the modernist side. They're using their considerable weight to push back. The true synodal thing for them to do would be to issue some kind of document that would allow the traditional Latin Mass to come back at least a little bit more than Traditionis Custodes. After all, it would be listening to diverse voices and being inclusive and equitable and journeying together. But that probably won't happen. And if that little bit happens, still nowhere near what Summorum Pontificum said, these voices don't want that to happen, because it will allow Catholic worship to stand side by side next to the new Synodal Church in the same spaces to some degree. And they can't do that. That's why these places implementing Traditionis Custodes right now, every week I'm telling you about at least one, if not two, high-profile TLM parishes somewhere in the U.S. getting their masses canceled. They can't have them existing side by side. What's left, what's being allowed to survive at this point are things on the hinterlands of dioceses, in the industrial waste parts of town, in the big cities, or out in the rural areas, away from the normal parish life, which is exactly what Traditionis Custodes called for, to sequester Catholics away from their new synodal religion, as they called it themselves. I'm hoping that you see this growing problem here. It's all connected. Everything we talk about here is connected. Let me know what you think about this in the comments, please. And remember to pray for the voices we spoke negatively about. I promise you, not trying to make you mad, in this case, at Mr. Robert Mickens, by just cavalierly smearing Gen Z, which I'm not even a part of. And I have my own, generational issues with them, as one generation, a member of one generation to others will always have. But he cavalierly dismisses Gen Z's concerns, and really the concerns of everybody who calls himself a traditional Catholic. Pray for him. And always pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.